As-salamu Aleikum. Hope you're doing well, inshallah. Today I wanted to discuss my experience with Surah Al Baqarah over the past year. I'll give a bit of an intro, inshallah, if you are not familiar with what happened this past year. So, last January, a year ago, I announced a Surah Al Baqarah memorization group for sisters. And this was at the request of several sisters who wanted to memorize Surah Al Baqarah or who were trying to memorize Surah Al Baqarah and wanted to have a sisterhood group so that we could hold each other accountable, inshallah. So I finally agreed to do it last January. So the way it worked was I created a schedule for the whole year for us to all memorize Surah Al-Baqarah together by the end of the year, inshallah. Spoiler alert, I did not hit the goal, but I will talk more about that throughout this video, inshallah. So basically the schedule, I'll post an example of the schedule here, and the schedule was pretty much memorizing one verse a day at most, just one verse a day. Very simple, or so I thought. Okay, one verse a day. And then we had days throughout each month where we would meet for study days and go over a bunch of verses together to understand the tafsir behind it, the meaning, like the reasoning for it coming down, and so on, inshallah. So we connect more with the verses. And inshallah, it would help us with the memorization journey as well if we understand the verses more. And then we would also meet every month at different points to review each other's memorization. So we would, one person recites, the other person corrects, and so on. Okay, so that is a quick summary on what we were doing this year. Now I'm going to tell you about my experience. I'm going to break it down into a few sections, and I hope, inshallah, that it's beneficial for anybody who is on this journey of memorization, on a similar journey, on a journey of learning, studying, memorizing, whatever it is. I hope that it is beneficial, inshallah. So I'm going to break this down into sections. I'm going to mention things that I realized were helpful throughout the memorization journey. I'm going to talk about things I thought were going to be helpful, but I was wrong. So things I was wrong about. I'm going to talk about my personal struggles with the memorization journey. And then I'll just conclude with final thoughts, future plans, what I'm going to be doing. Again, as I mentioned, I have not completed memorization yet, and I will get into the details why, the things I struggled with. MashaAllah, there are several sisters who were on track and they have completed their Surah Al Baqarah memorization. We had extra sessions to kind of listen to their memorization from verse 1 to 286. MashaAllah, it's been an amazing experience. But I am not one of those sisters yet. I'll explain, inshallah, in more detail. And I hope, inshallah, that this is beneficial. I hope it's a reminder also that, sometimes we set goals for ourselves and we don't necessarily hit them, but it's important to reflect, adjust, evaluate, and figure out steps forward, inshallah. So that's what this video is going to be about. Okay, the first thing that I realized was helpful, a routine. A routine is crucial. So what ended up happening with me is that we started in January and then I traveled the whole month of January and came back in February. And then I traveled again right after Ramadan for another month or so. And then I traveled again in October, November, and beginning of December. So I was gone for a little over 2 months. And that threw my routine out of the window. So when I traveled in January, it was okay because we were just starting. And so I was still on track. I was able to keep up with that. It wasn't too bad. I was still on track January, February, March. And then when Ramadan came in April, my routine went out of the window because again, Ramadan, the month was so different. And so I lost my routine. I was trying to do too many things. I'll talk about that in more detail as well, but that also impacted my routine, and that's when I started to fall behind. Starting from Ramadan, I'll get into that in more detail, inshallah. Okay, the second thing that is super helpful, reviewing, repetition, repetition, as much as you can, wherever you are. Use it in your prayer, use it when you're doing things, use it throughout the day. Start your day with checking your memorization, end your day with checking your memorization. It's super important to keep reviewing. On the days that I would not check and not review, I would see the impact on those days. Number 3, really figuring out what helps you specifically in memorization, because something that's helpful to one person is not going to be also helpful to you necessarily. So you kind of have to do a trial and error and figure out what exactly works for you and what helps you in memorization. So for me, understanding the tafsir helped so much. Understanding the context behind the verses, and more than just what the verses are saying, but the background behind them and just much more depth into them. It helped me so much because I was more connected to the verses and I knew more about them, so I could remember what was coming. That helped a lot. The second thing that I realized personally helped me was recognizing patterns. So recognizing things like repeated words, or verses that start with the same thing, or verses that end with the same things. Like finding those patterns. When, for example, there are verses that Allah gives a challenge to a group, they end in a similar way, for example. I'll try to post some examples here of some patterns, but that really helped me a lot, because then I wouldn't rely on solely my memory, but I would also rely on knowing these certain patterns as well. So I found that really helpful for me personally. Taking notes. This also I found really helpful. So after studying the tafsir, understanding the verses, also taking notes, writing down each verse and then the explanation, the tafsir behind it, and so on, and actually writing it down solidified it for me. So I found that also really helpful. Doing it as a group. I was so grateful that we took this on as a group, alhamdulillah, because if it wasn't for the group, I would have fallen way behind and probably stopped ages ago and given up. But the sisters held me accountable because I had to show up. I had to show up to the study sessions with slides and notes prepped. I had to be there. So even though I was falling behind on memorization, it still kept me going and being on track with the schedule that we were following with the study group sessions and attending the review sessions and so on. Because I couldn't not show up. So that held me accountable, alhamdulillah. So doing it as a group was super helpful. Okay, let's talk about things I thought were going to be helpful, but I was wrong. The first one, I touched upon this, which is Ramadan. I thought that Ramadan was going to be an incredible month for me to get ahead of memorization, because I was like, okay, this is a month where I'm going to be striving a lot more, doing a lot more, reading more Quran, connected more with the Quran. So it's going to be a month where I'm really going to focus on my memorization and get ahead. But the complete opposite happened. That's when I started to fall behind in Ramadan. I could not find a good routine to do my memorization along with everything else I was trying to do in Ramadan. I was working full time in Ramadan. I was holding additional sisterhood sessions, daily sisterhood sessions for Quran recitation. I was also trying to attend daily another Quran recitation sisterhood group, and I was taking an Islamic class at the same time. And then add to it my own personal goals that I had in Ramadan. I was squeezed so tight with time and I took on too much and I was too ambitious with what I could achieve in Ramadan. The one thing that I had to kind of put to the side, or kind of, I don't know what the right phrasing is, but the one thing that fell behind was my Surah Al Baqarah memorization, because that was the one thing that I was accountable for on my own. Everything else I had, everything else I was kind of forced to. I had to show up, right? I had to show up to our sisterhood sessions. I had to show up to work. I had to show up to certain things. So what ended up falling to the side was my memorization for Surah Al Baqarah, which I did not expect to happen in Ramadan. The second thing is short verses versus long verses. I thought that the long verses would be much harder to memorize than the short verses. But interestingly, it was the opposite. I found it much easier to memorize those long verses that take up 5, 6 lines, half a page, rather than the short verses that are one verse, another verse, another. And it was because they were disjointed, separate verses. Something about the longer verses made it easier for me to memorize than the shorter ones, which I thought was going to be the opposite. Okay, let's talk about my specific struggles. Related to this long verse, short verse thing, I found that it was much easier for me to memorize verses that had some sort of story happening in it. For example, the cow section, which is why Surah Al Baqarah is named Surah Al Baqarah, the story of Al Baqarah, the cow. In it, those verses I found them really easy to memorize. Like just reading them a few times, understanding what happened in the story, I was able to memorize them and just move on to the next thing. But then the verses that they weren't necessarily a story and they were more disjointed, that was much harder for me to memorize. So I had to spend a lot more time on those verses to remember the order and the sequence of verses because it was less of a story kind of theme happening in them. And that's why actually I think it was easier for me to memorize the longer verses than the shorter verses that I mentioned a little while ago, because the longer verses, they typically I found them to be a sequence of events happening in that verse, so it kind of made sense logically, and I found it easier to memorize than the shorter, disjointed ones that were not always necessarily a sequence of events happening. The second thing that I struggled with is transitions. Transitions between sections. For example, you finish the section of the cow and then you move on to another topic or another section, and I found it difficult to remember what section is coming next. So sometimes there would be points where I would skip a section and then go on to the next section because I would forget a certain section. So that was and is one of my struggles, to remember the sequence of sections happening when the topic changes or a section changes. Third thing that I struggled with is the ending of verses that are similar to other verses. For example, there are a lot of verses that end with a description of Allah, whether He is Basir or Khabir or Alim or whatever word describes Him, right? I found myself and still find myself in present tense confusing these endings. So I struggled with these endings and finding ways and patterns to try to memorize these endings. Number 4, fa and wa. Okay, these little tiny letters that you don't think too much about, but fa and wa. This, and I know I wasn't alone in this one, so it was kind of comforting to see that, okay, there are several of us that are flipping the fa and the wa. You know, it's such a tiny letter, but so, you know, some words will have the fa and some will have wa, and then there are some verses that are similar, but one will have fa, the other one will have wa. So just knowing all of the fas and the was, these little words that make a big difference, right, when you're memorizing Quran. So I also struggled to remember these little subtle letters. Okay, my final thoughts slash future plans. So we are done with the Surah Al Baqarah session, but I'm still holding myself accountable. And what I'm planning to do, inshallah, is to keep memorizing, and I'm giving myself a goal of a few months, inshallah, to solidify my memorization. We have an ongoing thing going that anybody who is not done yet, but maybe is going to be done in a month, 2 months, 3 months, that we will continue to have some review sessions, and then also we'll have some sessions later on in the year to check everyone's memorization once they are done completing Surah Al Baqarah. So that way I'm holding myself accountable I am because I'm leaving the group open so that we kind of finish it together, inshallah. So that is the plan. Plan is to not give up, inshallah, and inshallah this video will also hold me accountable by you seeing this video. If you're seeing this video in a few months, hold me accountable and ask me where did you reach in Surah Al Baqarah, so that I can be held accountable, inshallah. I hope that this was beneficial. I hope this is a reminder that, you know, we don't always hit our goals, but inshallah we evaluate and we adjust. And also a reminder that had we not even started the goal, we wouldn't have even gotten to where we are today, right? So for example, when we compare to last year, you know, when we were at 0, for example, but now, even though we didn't finish our goal 100%, even if we are 50%, right? That is so much better than 0. So that is still a massive achievement, a massive improvement, and inshallah that encourages us to keep going to hit the 100%. And so I hope that this is an encouraging reminder for you if you are on a memorization journey or any other goal that you have set for yourself, inshallah, that even if you haven't hit that goal but you're still ahead of zero, then that's amazing, inshallah. So keep going, and even if you are at zero, you can still go forward, inshallah. And yeah, that's what my experience has been. Alhamdulillah, it's been a really rewarding experience just diving through Surah Al Baqarah and understanding the verses in this level of detail. And I don't know how to explain it, but when you study Quran in detail, there is a level of connection that is just so it really touches your heart. It really touches your heart. So even if you're not on a memorization journey, don't stop studying the Quran and learning it on a deeper level, inshallah, because I don't know, it changes you. It changes you reflecting on the verses, learning, studying, subhanallah. It's just yeah, and sitting with people who are also learning the Quran and wanting to be connected with the Quran is just such a different energy and a different vibe. So I'm very grateful that we did this, even though I didn't hit my goal, but we'll keep going, inshallah. And yeah, alhamdulillah for everything. I hope that you found benefit in this, inshallah. And I guess I'll keep you posted when I'm done, inshallah. As-salamu Aleikum.